All right, so welcome back. We're doing advanced grid management. So basically, I want to get some basics of how you should think about managing your grid. So during the first half of the cycle, the cycle is 17 seconds for the grid timer. During the first half of that, you want to make a lot of decisions that are more neutral-based and not necessarily grid-based. So for example, at the first half of the cycle, it's perfectly safe to burn as much grid as you like. It's not really important because it's very easy to make up that grid later in the cycle. So near the first half of the cycle, if you need to chain shift, you can chain shift. That's a good decision. If you need to use force function in combos, that's perfectly fine. If you want to end your combo in really good Oki, that's a really good idea. So you can make those kinds of decisions that are more neutral-based or neutral conscious decisions or more fighting game conscious decisions. So just decisions you would make in a normal fighting game, the traditional 2D fighter, like you put yourself in a good position, you could have good Okizeme, you have good meter or damage build. So sometimes you have to sacrifice these elements when you want to make grid conscious decisions. So grid conscious decisions are decisions that are more making these decisions based on building grid and not necessarily on traditional 2D fighters. Like for example, like I said, sacrificing position or Okizeme, sacrificing those things for grid instead is a more grid conscious decisions. And you want to make those decisions near the second half of the cycle, so at 50%. So at half timer, this is around the timer where you want to start making decisions that build your grid, like concentrating more, throwing more shield, or using enders, combo enders that build grid. Another important part of the timer that I want to talk about is the last 3 to 4 seconds, the 70% of the grid timer. I like to consider this the critical seconds of the grid war, in which any small decision that you make during this time is really important for winning the Vorpal War, because 1 or 2 quick shields or like a quick throw is enough to completely throw the grid advantage into your favor or into your opponent's favor. So that small window is where you should be most conscious about building grid and about making sure that you don't end up losing grid yourself. So scenarios in which you want to focus on these elements, for example, in combos, you can be grid conscious in your combos by ending in a lot of moves that build your grid. For example, Enkidu 5cc, for the record, builds your grid. So ending combo, if he does a combo near the first half of the cycle, he might just want to go for a standard Oki ender, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're near the second half of the cycle, you notice that you have a grid deficit, then it might be more important to actually end this combo in 5cc. Okay, well, I think if let's try that again. Okay, there we go. So in that case, I managed to build good grid, but I didn't necessarily get a good Oki situation because I had to make a more grid-conscious decision in order to win the Vorpal War. Some characters are a lot better about this, like Gordo, for example, has a simulation. A simulation is both a good grid-conscious decision and neutral decision because it gives you good knockdown and also builds you grid. So some characters have an easier time than others. Usually the better characters do. So these decisions you need to make in combos. Again, if you're in the second half of the cycle, you want to avoid using force function. Force function loses your grid. So you want to avoid using that in your combos if it's the second half of the cycle, because then you end up putting yourself in a grid deficit during the grid war. But again, in the first half of the cycle, it's perfectly fine to use force function as much as you want. You still have a lot of time to make up that difference. In neutral, it's more of the standard stuff. I've already kind of gone over most of this. So you want to be more aggressive near the end of the cycle to build your more grid. Moving forward, doing positive actions, and being less passive near the second half of the cycle. If you're playing characters that's a zoner, then it's okay to be really passive. Like if you're playing Yuzu and you just want to zone out for the first half of the cycle, that's perfectly fine. If your opponent builds a lot of grid, it's not a big deal. But during the second half of the cycle, you might want to start easing up on the zoning and instead focusing on a more aggressive style. So rather than zoning all day, you just might want to go in a lot. And again, landing hits, concentrating, those are all ways to build grid. If you're really far behind during the second half of the cycle and you're both at neutral, sometimes VOing and then just quickly building grid is a good way to really throw the grid cycle in your favor. So I want to kind of go over the critical seconds again. So the last 3 seconds of the cycle is where, again, you have to make really important decisions. So if you're in a grid deficit, then you really need to make some kind of risk or commit to something in order to win that Vorpal cycle. Because at this point, if say Gordo has 5 blocks of grid, there's not much. I have to get either a hit on him, like assault at him, or I got to get a clean throw on him in order to win this grid cycle. So it's around that time where you have to kind of make some kind of decision, or in order to open up your opponent and get some grid. Whereas your opponent doesn't really have to make any real decisions, they can just wait out the timer. So Gordo has about 5 blocks of grid. If he just chooses to block, he's going to win the Vorpal cycle, and he doesn't really have to do much. So it's at that point where you have to open up your opponent, but your opponent doesn't have to do much. That's why you really want to have a grid lead near the end of the cycle. That way you don't have to commit to anything. You can be very safely win the grid war that way. If you're on defense though, you can shield. Like say your opponent is Gordo, and you have the grid. You have a grid deficit, and Gordo has a grid lead still. Then shielding again is a really good way to build a lot of grid. There, I managed to build a complete bar of grid just with like two or three good shields. So, if your opponent was in a grid loss, they might try to throw you. So you might want to be ready to take a throw or to shield whatever their offense might be. So. Again, if you're in a grid deficit, you might have to commit to something like shielding. Shielding opens you up to getting grid broken like this. Oh, not like that. Like that. So you might get grid broken, which might just completely lose you the game. So you want to be wary of these kind of situations. So just to summarize, for the first half of the cycle, you want to make more neutral conscious decisions. So build meter, Oki, damage, stuff like that. Second half of the cycle, you want to be more grid conscious. You want to make decisions that build you a lot of grid and don't lose you a lot of grid. For the last couple 3 seconds of the cycle, you want to be hyper conscious of grid and just make sure you make decisions that maintain your grid safely, or you might need to take a risk and to build the last 1 or 2 blocks of grid that you need to win that cycle. Okay, so that kind of ends today's lessons. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.